world building rough draft core conceptual groundwork note. The issue of many iterations of home planet. In a sort of real life backstory, behind the scenes insight, I've long struggled with identifying, naming, and narratively establishing the home baseline planet, the one in which the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo is trapped in the penultimate reality behind all the narrative storytelling. All of the many adventures of the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo are within the fictional framework of the character Mr. Zeppo is the author of the books that bear his name, as opposed to, for example, me, the person that I am, and in my real-life context. I am also a character in the books somewhere, but I digress. That's neither here nor there. And when I say, the prison planet, I should more accurately, I didn't want to, I should have said, I should have disclaimered, spoiler alert, this, quote, home base planet is not Zeppo's native soil. For many reasons, not the least of which being that he's not a being born of a mother residing, in situation, as science might say, of their natural habitat on a planet. And I say that scientifically, but also with air quotes of it's technically the wrong word, but let's move on from that. Pin on the corkboard. But for clarity, Zeppo is from outside of the known, knowable universe of the fictional audience / reader that is depicted, discussed, and sometimes directly engaged with in a sort of breaking the fourth wall of narrative fiction kind of way. If it were a movie, it would be Ryan Reynolds looking directly into the camera and talking to you as an individual sort of moment. And then cutting back to the sort of inside the world of the scene. But having said that and leaving that dangling and putting it aside up on the shelf, where would Zeppo explain his actual origins from? It's a mind-boggling place because the people of the home base planet, which is the planet that is the actual setting of most of the books as they are presented. For example, if you were to be browsing books in a bookstore, hold on a second. I jumped into this note and I didn't pause to make sure. I tried to baffle, extenuating local sounds, like my big giant clunky washing machine washing towels. Okay, and who knows, maybe you guys couldn't hear that, but somehow I'll work that sort of thing into some moment later on, in adjacence to this. But I realized I was ill prepared to start this note taking. But in short, and I've rambled about this before in some previous other place of world-building, rough draft idea note-taking, the known universe from the home planet of any given, humanoid being, whether they be earthlings on Earth or stonelings from planet Stone, etc. at all, there's an infinite multiverse of home of living planetoids that are the center of the universe, but also not the center of the universe in a fractal, toroidal, infinitely recursive, exponentially bifurcating, intradimensional kind of way. And now that sentence may be very confusing to some people, even really smart people, especially if they've never heard it said in that particular structuring and explained. Put a big fat red pin on the corkboard for, I think I have tried to explain it somewhere else, but it was not in this current context. I digress. The actual origins of the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo as a character within his own literature is that of a meta-universal being from beyond the boundaries of the, quote, known universe of planet, and this is the note I'm trying to get to, is I finally conceived of a name for the planet where Zeppo finds himself stuck, and in need of sort of saving himself, and thus he does these various storytelling activities, which are the fictional, quote-unquote, real-world context of the meta-narrative for all of the different individual book titles and their subseries in the Zeppoverse collection of books. So, if the known and knowable universe can be called the egg, and we can understand that the egg is an infinitely recursive, holographic, living fractal incubator for all possible life expressions, conceivable and manifestable, manifestable, right? Able to be made manifest in an infinite toroidal shitstorm of every possible variation on a highly individuated but also spiritually collectivist expression of living species that achieves self-awareness, and with the goal of incubating all life which is being made manifest by a singularity of that which is to be called the I am, the consciousness behind all consciousnesses, which is the nuclei of the egg, right? Mr. Zeppo, if you can imagine him in a metaversal place, which you could consider to be akin to a Tron original film aesthetic level minimalist egg factory, in which there's a, quote, factory floor, in which there's various procedures and mechanisms and you know, conveyance bands. You might also think of the and don't sue me, Disneyland. It's just kind of a matter of fact, sort of, it mildly inspired me a little bit. The conveyor belts and the sort of idea of being in the midst of all the busy work of a galactic spaceport over at Tomorrowland in the original. And I'm not talking, although the new stuff over in Star Wars Land is pretty awesome. Galaxy's Edge is I only rode the one big new ride, but I digress. This factory floor with many conveyances and conveyor belts and you know, semi-autonomous robotic arm type working machines, and then also white lab coat individual beings, which are look like people. They look like people in a clean suit with a silver dome viewing like helmet, but if you can imagine like an introductory scene where we get to travel across this factory floor as one individual sort of does a survey and inspection of whatever o'clock of the day. It's the most important inspection of the day. Make sure that this inspection before we move on to the next, process or whatever. And when they exit the clean room of the giant factory floor and they remove all of their, white protective, anti-static, antimicrobial, whatever kind of green suit after being cleared for exiting this very important, very voluminous, very monstrous, very minimally staffed space, you realize that the silver dome thing is not the protective outer layer but the raw surface plate of these beings' faces, somehow in a sort of counterintuitive way. Thus, some of the pictures you may or may not have seen of, some of the self-portraiture of the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo with the featureless silver chrome dome face. And here's the new content. Unless I've forgotten it, the third planetoidal living mother matrix womb orb, as it is known in some instances of the metaverse, the living gestational honeypot, perfect spot, Goldilocks planetoid, which is a living being in and of itself, and always is in every instance, no matter what the living, talking, genomic flesh pods might ideate about, whilst they tear about the surface of her uterus, may think, whatever the little talking people may or may not argue about, these things are alive. And on this particular, if you can conceive of the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo having, for various reasons, found his way into the inside of a particular egg, the nature and specific structure and parameters of, we will have to discuss at another time. But this egg is slightly unique and slightly different than any of the other common eggs you may see on the factory floor. Coughing. This third rock from the sun, Don't Sue Me, whoever owns that other show's title. And also, if you're old enough to remember that show in real life, we should be friends. That was a cool show. I was on it once. Also, that should be embedded in the world-building character stuff of like a fictionalized fan fiction version of that show, and some exaggerated way in which Zeppo may or may not have been involved with it. But on this actual, imagine the setting of the place where like Zeppo is narrating his own Ford Prefect-like tormentuous, what is it when you're not a castaway? Well, I guess sort of a castaway. When you're stranded on a planet, there's a word for that. That's a transference of the word for when you're stranded on an island or some other landmass and you've through extenuating circumstances, no immediate ways to depart. Is it castaway? At any rate, in the Zeppoverse, in this storytelling, world-building place, this third living Mother Earth is called Terth, or Teherth, the third Earth, because in the particular context and world-building history of reality and the mythologies, this is a place very much like your own planet Rock, planet Mud, planet Earth, planet Gaia, planet Orbital Mother, planet insert whatever colloquial variety of the name that you call Your living planetoidal orbital gestational life form inducing station for living things to live their lives. That's the technical description of what's happening. Whether it's on your planet, insert the name of your planet there, or mine, or on Earth, or on any of the alternate Earths that call themselves Earth with a different designation to differentiate and disambiguate, or any of the variants of any of the names I've already used. They all have the following in common. Whether you believe in it or not, whether any of the people living there believe in it or not, she is alive, and she's literally a womb gestating all the living things there, which are one being, one entity, one singularity of consciousness that is the meta-mind bringing about the infinite toroidal recursive probabilistic holographic projections of all realities being churned into existence in your universe. So on Terth, or Terth, and it's a planet torn apart by whether or not the really supercilious argument, whether it's like tomato, is it Terth or is it Teherth? There is also an adjunct but quite separate debate about whether or not Terth is a living entity or not, but it's not quite as popular, thus not considered quite as important. And most people, if surveyed on the street, would be very much like people you would find in your neighborhoods. You know, the nation states that have cropped up on the surface area of continental shore drift erosion land platforms on this semi-spherical, hexagonal, living meta-holographic projectional, life womb, life uterus, all basically resemble the ones you're familiar with in your own home setting, dear audience. Whether you're listening or reading or viewing this in the not-too-distant future or in some long, unimaginable future from now. But on Earth, they're so... The humans there, the people that populate this planetoid, this living gem of a system of living systems, which is implicitly and explicitly designed to provide an ongoing context for the iteration of an infinite variety of life experiences. Because as is explained in the mythological, ever-persistent, ubiquitous story, irregardless of what author is attributed in whatever contextual timeline or present self localization you may find yourself in ubiquity throughout all time frames, in all universes, in all contexts that most life forms may find themselves in, someone somewhere has written the mind-boggling short story known as The Cosmic Egg, or simply The Egg, in which someone very much like you has just passed away and is having a conversation with a being that resembles some historical, iconic, grandfatherly meta figure, and obviously is a direct intimation and or direct reference to some sort of god being, who explains to the recently deceased, yes, your life, yes, but also know that all lives, every life that you can imagine, that you can conceive of, that you historically are convinced actually already happened, and all that might potentially would have happened after yours have already been lived, are being lived, will always be lived by you. That which is the center of your awareness, that is the thing you call yourself. I am, the me, myself, and I, of the internal awareness. The singularity point of your mind is simultaneously making all of it happen and perceiving it, all of it happen from a very localized, individuated place where it feels quite separate and heavily localized. But the meta collectivist I am, and it isn't collectivist by ideological definition, but collectivist by physical, literal, almost inconceivable form and function of being simultaneously a singularity that encompasses the whole and a fractal individuation and distillation of that singularity down into every conceivable, potential, probabilistically renderable ideation of a me, of an individuated me. So me, you, every possible variation of me and you, and us and them. Put a pin on that, because there's us versus them, and then there's us and them. They're two different formulas of ideating, distillating the world down into supposedly accurate ideological models, which are often deeply flawed, friends. But I digress. On thearthz, people, the world, the society is very much like your own, but imagine it like 65 years ahead of where you imagine your next best era of your life might be. And so, for example, it's not 65 years from now exactly. It's like 65 years from 20 years from now. I don't know. So it's 100 years from now, essentially. But it might also be 1,000 years from now. It might also be 10,000 years from now, because it's recursively happened and happening in multiple timelines and time frames in very, 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 very explicitly similar, almost identical ways. So we can sort of context hop for comparison, contrast purposes, and comedic purposes. But it boils down to a sort of let me back up. On planet thearthz, there was a political debacle of a presidency by an individual whose family dynastic name is Krumpft. But there's a top secret, like, it used to be something else, and they changed it some odd generations ago. And they changed it from Drumpf, which they had previously, I don't know. I don't know how serious I should get with flirting with the I want to connect it to the fact that I've literally been, to address continuity issues. I've literally been in Good Morning Trumptopia describing things in the sense of it being Trump. I want to clarify, in the world of thearthz, Trump is foreign and fictional and goofy sounding. No one would name themselves Trump. But there is people just like the Trump family Don't sue me, folks. I'm trying to be inspired by real life, but also write pure fiction. I don't know. I don't know how people get away with that, other than invoking the parody and satire clause. But there's a family, krumpft, who has like the weird open secret that they used to be called the Trumpfs, Trump's, and then they changed it to KRUMPF, Krumpfs. And in this, like, fictional future history, the children of Donald Trump's children are indeed the establishment order in a collectivist empire that is, meant to sort of look like the really, like a pre-Andron, like the roots of like something becoming an epically large, monolithic tyranny structure of space, galactic spanning proportions. Although we're not quite there yet, right? Like we're just at the near or final, pre-dystopian age of like, okay, we're about to actually really become spacefaring. So if we can borrow from various traditions, the krumpft Empire is the central pillar of a three-part North American empire of empires, and they have this history of sort of their legacy began back when good old grandfather Krumpf was president for a term and unsuccessfully, failed to establish himself for a second and third term at that time, but they came back with a vengeance. And now the Krumpf family, as a dynastic political empire, rules 1/3 of the North American English-speaking political monolith, which is the beginnings of a meta empire, of a corporate politico socioeconomic tyranny that is hyper normalized and is the church, right? And there's still enough freedom of speech that there are fissures of disagreement and alternative political parties, but they have next to no power or influence beyond local regional opposition, but at the continental confab jurisdictional level, it's almost as if they don't exist, right? They are recognized and their human rights are respected, but all the underpinnings of that respect are being undermined and ground away as we speak. And planet Earth, it's in this sort of near dystopic sci-fi dysfunctional futurism where we're nowhere near becoming the Star Trek level, spacefaring, optimistic, having transcended the dystopia of the self-destructive, and toxic economic system. Instead, we're leaning into everything Krumpf, which is all the wrong things, right? Like a massive, intentional, oppressive, chauvinistic, tyrannical, top-down church and state of vague, oppressive, and often hate-filled minority vilification rhetoric, and a need culturally to sort of like call attention to all of that being untenable in the long term. So the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo is stuck in a world where he has no superpowers, having lived many lifetimes in worlds where he does, because this is the one like dead egg universe in which all of his usual toolkit of psychokinetic, one might say esoterically superhero type metahuman powers are as limited as one can conceive, to the point where he's convinced that he has zero access to any of them. But he finds himself the most individuated that he's ever been, which, unlike most people's experience, using the word people as broadly as you can open-mindedly conceive of, is the exact opposite of what most people live their individuated life like. The incorrigible Mr. Zeppo, in his adventure comic book form, as is written by this sort of hyper normalized and hyper meta superpower dysfunctional version of Zeppo, he's not used to being a singular individuated person. He's used to being a meta being that's aware of all the expressions of the potentialities that he has access to, right? It's like if, for anyone who is stuck in high-level individuation, imagine being able to not only remember all of your past lives, but also realize you are everyone else you encounter in your immediate, distillated time frame continuum tunnel that you might be journeying through. And you are also every possible variant of your individuated self that might express itself in parallel, holographic, probabilistic, sliderverse in every possible direction, contingent on free will decision-making branching of the toroidal, individuated self probabilistic waveform tunnel, right? So every person that can conceive of themselves as an individual has in this universe a very real, very probabilistically driven toroidal waveform tree of all their possible other selves, and that gets really complicated and very difficult to map out. That's why you just imagine a tree as the most simplistic way. But it's a fractal iteration tree, which is constantly churning in many dimensions, including inwards towards its own center. For those who might be able to visualize that, how I would describe that in literary terms, I'd have to actually put hands to keyboard to get the most eloquent. But in terms of like what the visual effects may look like, imagine an algorithmic toroidal spinning, churning rope of a tree made of many trees that are constantly churning inwards and outwards to render as many possible probabilistic outcomes, the endpoints being an individuated being that can only perceive the tunnel of their branch of infinite possibilities. That's what we are as individuals. In the Zeppo-verse, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo is infinitely self-aware of all those tree branches and jumps around them. But now he's sort of stuck somewhere in a non-localized tunnel or branch that's hyper-individuated, but it's also sort of maybe the center through line of the entire, like, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo fractal toroidal tree universe of all the possible Zeppo verses that he could be living out. You know, all the infinite lives he could be living in all the different iterations. And the touchstone being that he's stuck on this planet knowing that he lives multiple lifetimes as an hyper-individuated Mr. Zeppo, against the backdrop of this recurring history of histories, where this world is a sort of like nightmare world of all the things that are going wrong in the real world, wherever your real world might be, dear listener, dear reader, dear viewer, dear audience at all. It's echoed in this vector space metaversal hyper world that is also super, like, for as fantastic as it may seem to the reader, everything's super mundane to the individuals that are living their lives within it. And that's pure, like, hellish torture to Mr. Zeppo, because he's used to living and being quite powerful in the inverse opposite expression of being, a quite powerful, pardon the fact that I have to borrow this phrase, almost godlike being to any individuated, Homo sapien-like species living on any particular planetoid or another. On planet Turth, all he has is his wild and wacky fiction that he's writing. Now, therein may lie some metaphysical, psycho-spiritual, cosmic, holographic magic, but that's hitherto yet to be explored in terms of content that has been written or planned, outlined, plotted to be written anytime soon. Being stuck without powers, he can only visualize and obsessively dream out the sort of alternate realities in which he does have superpowers and in which he's literally, manifestly fighting this fight against the encroachment of tyrannical greed-oriented corruption in the human spirit, the human mind, the human soul, and the human genomic species. Whatever it calls itself, however it ideates, it's about itself. And whatever it may look like, and whatever its context may appear to be, all people have this one thing in common. In regardless of what egg they might be contextualized, they are the yolk. Their mind, their soul, is the yolk of that egg. The nuclear center of all the minds that are minding being, brought into existence. I digress. He's locked away in this world and therefore writes about a way that theoretically he might be able to transcend the mundane boundaries of this world that keep him so hyper individuated into a non-magical, non-surreal, non-super meta-humanish, human-powered existence, right? He's just a plain old ordinary meatbag that can talk and have crazy ideas in this world. But he's a being that is used to surfing all the other places of existing where he's the exact opposite. And thus the crazy, wild, and bizarre stories that he tells and that he writes about. The characters that are reading, the characters in the literature that I'm writing, that are reading the literature that Mr. Zeppo is writing on Turth, live on Turth, but don't realize that they live on Turth because they call it something else. And so they're super confused about like what he's talking about and what he's warning them about, and whether or not he is a good guy or whether or not he is something else. And he is, of course, very unfairly, unjustly, and irrationally framed as being something nefarious, and thus some of the real world, good cop versus bad cop chasing a suspect that they can't decide between each other whether or not he's the right suspect kind of scenarios that we find him in when he's not busy writing about his supernatural adventures in other dimensions of the Zeppoverse, right? His goal being to free everyone trapped on Turth from living this nightmarish, mundane world, because they're in a dead end. They seem to be in some sort of impossible dead end path or trajectory. Every branch of every possible, every individuated life has its own branching tree of branching trees, but there's also a collective phenomena that is built by everyone living on this planetoidal, living, holographic mother womb matrix that we should not destroy simply for profit, the way you would not cheer on apple seeds destroying the envelope that is the apple, bringing them to the place where they will take root and become an apple tree. You wouldn't, because it would be like they'll never become an apple tree. They'll die if they cannibalize the apple before it ripens and falls off the tree organically and gets eaten by the whatever's going to eat it, and that's his dilemma in the world, which prompts him to write the stories that he's got to write. He refuses to believe that this can be true, that there can be a toroidal, cosmic, universal, collective, planetoidal timeline in which he is just a mundane flesh pod person with no Zeppoverse, meta spiritual powers that he enjoys throughout his other various adventures, which he writes about as if it were fiction in this world, because people would call him crazy if he claimed to know that he had lived these other worlds that were just like this world, but things were different. He's convinced that his mission, that the reason he finds himself here, trapped on this world where everyone believes in the most flattened down, non-spiritual, hypocritical, self-destructive, toxic worldviews possible, and are arguing about those, right? Like the most ridiculous things to be arguing about, they will blow each other's brains out in this world over. and not bat an eye, because it's just like, it's welcome to Krumftopia, and a world in which Krumftopia has been slowly becoming not just normalized, but the actual central pillar of the North American continental empire that is the largest economic driving force in the global economy of 2121, right? To that end, it is that he is pursued by Agent McNally and others, some believing him to be a nefarious ne'er-do-well that's out to do something inconceivably irreprehensible and wrong, and even by their corrupt standards of what is normal and acceptable being done on the world stage, intolerable and beyond the pale. Whatever it is that they fear he might do, I don't even want to conceptualize of, because these are pretty rotten, horribly corrupt people that run the world on Earth. Irregardless of what continental confab empire of corporate nation state interests you want to criticize, they all have their problems. It's not like you can be like, oh, the Eurocons are morally superior to the North American triumvirate, but that's a whole nother debate, which rages on because people have got something to be worked up about in this fictional context. But being trapped there like a tourist whose teleporter needs an impossible ingredient that cannot be found anywhere nearby, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo spends multiple generations writing various forms of entertainment content, quote unquote, that's never really deeply appreciated. But that's all him trying to figure out a way to attract people towards what he believes, erroneously, to be one way to save himself from being seemingly imprisoned in this like prison verse, this prison, this highly individuated expression of everything that he typically is not. But in part it's because he sort of lacks an understanding of what the function is of this time frame, this central through line, and how it relates to all the other ones. But somewhere in his own intuition and in his own obsessive compulsive need to create this content over many lifetimes, mind you, because he keeps living these different lifetimes where he's the same person. No one else seems to notice that he just lives and dies, and that he seems to come out of impossible virgin births, which is a weird detail. But he's also not ever looked on as either the Christ nor the Antichrist. He's just this being that exists and is the most mundane, most benignly and like impossibly ineffectual, like boring, normal ass person who's just got a wacky, wild ass imagination and writes the wildest and most fascinating of narrative or cinematic, new age, proto atypical sci-fi adventure dramas that people sort of are drawn to but also repelled from, and that never quite make it into sort of mainstream super popularity, right? He's always sort of forgotten, perpetually forgotten, and then rediscovered in his new in whatever new age, so that people don't realize he's been doing it in every age, right? But it's there. Someone eventually does dig up the proof, because it's never like unprovable. But he's there. It's like he's been in every age, arguing amongst every philosophical generation, every political generation, every religious generation. There's been a being, which arguably can be easily rationally explained away as one family tree of people, right? And it's how when he is ultimately discovered this way, he is immediately treated as like, no, it couldn't be one person constantly sort of regenerating after being killed in this otherwise super mundane, there are no superpowers sort of universe. So he's immediately written off as a lineage of fathers that beget other people who have just been eerily very consistent in their obsessions and in their intellectual discourse. But it's all marginalized constantly within every living moment, and enough time happens between his apparent disappearance, death from the world, and then reappearance, that he just gets swept up under the rug and forgotten about. But he's always arguing this meta theory about the form, nature, and function of reality that is a counter narrative to all the norms and all the establishments, whatever those might be, in any given universal context or planetoidal context, cultural, ideological context. But he's consistent in his criticism of them all, that they are, no matter how accurate they may or may not be, the accuracy is beyond improbabilistically like flawed, because it doesn't calculate for all the things that he's pointing to, and and refuses to allow for their existence, etc., etc. Thus, he builds this looming device, which is epically large in scale, but also representatively tiny in its presentation, which is a paradox it's difficult to write about, let alone try to discuss. But he pays the consequences for the design flaw inherent in his device, which is that he's correct and incorrect about the way he sees this Z space, which is like the center through line, most mundane, most probabilistically like not surreal, not magical, not, it's the most boring universe you can imagine. Bound to do the most abjectly self-destructively toxic and mundane things you can imagine doing, and be predisposed to disbelieve in any possibility beyond the very narrow scope of what they understand and know to be, quote unquote, real. And anything unreal is to be vilified, marginalized, dismissed out of hand, and never entertained thoughtfully and considered in any sort of meaningful way. And he's brimming with all this knowledge, Zeppo is, all this understanding, from directly having lived it, of this, infinite spectrum of possibility, beyond the boundaries of this black and white, sickly, like disgustingly monotone reality. And I sort of can't, I lack for the most accurate way to describe it, but it's the only analogy is like this place to him feels very much like it's only one dimension of what he knows to be a many-dimensional sort of normal bell curve of multi-dimensional probabilistic ways of experiencing life. So it's almost painful. But to everyone else, it's just what it is. It's just being alive. And it's inconceivable that anything can exist beyond the scope of what is known, as it is known. And to question it is madness. Never mind heresy, it's crazy cuckoo madness, laughable madness. Thus he is a clown, right? Zeppo is in this world in which he cannot be the hero that he wants to be, and or at least he doesn't think he can. At least not until he finds himself inescapably and unavoidably writing a book about a version just like that, but with a view and just enough access to some kind of magic, some kind of spiritual energy, some kind of transcendental comprehension beyond this one-dimensional mundaneness, that he thinks something is doable, something is possible, something is plausible, something can be done to transcend the ego limitations of the world as it is benignly, mundanely presented to him by his senses, because he does not want to live the merry-go-round meat grinder of endless life and death in a universe in which all other expressions of the toroidal holographic multiverse are denied, and the ultimate reality of the point of all of that infinite expression being the once and future birth of the singularity, transcending the experiencing of any form of individuation into some next level and arguably inexplicable experiencing of life in a universe unknowably different, because the egg is a birth canal into whatever the child within the egg will be born. It is the mechanics within the egg to manifest this holographic, fractal, recursive, infinite, spiraling array of many universes, and the central tentpole through line of mundane reality. This sort of quote-unquote really real reality. Imagine the most realist moment you've ever lived in your lifetime, dear listener, dear reader, dear viewer of the cinematic presentation of this concept. Imagine the most mundanest moment, and pretend that is impossibly surreal for what the most mundane baseline toroidal through-line nexus universe would be like. And then multiply that by 10, or 1,000,000, or 100 million, or a Googleplex billion. Because it gets abysmally, boringly real, right? And boring and agnostic and I don't want to say atheistic, but materialistic in its experiential vibe. But it is, for no matter how mundane this terth to hearth Z through line may be, this baseline of baselines of reality being the most mundanely real it could possibly imaginably ever be, beyond the most mundanely real thing you've ever experienced in your own reality, it is inherent and implicitly and explicitly necessary. It underpins all other existence and is also sort of brought into existence by all the other universes in iterative existence, which is a mind-boggling concept, which Zeppo implicitly understands and is trying to get everyone else in his prison universe to understand about their own reality so that they can transcend their ideated, individuated self and commune with their I am singularity self and heal the schism of this tentpole, bifurcating, through line. I've varied on what to call it. I used to call it the K line, I think. I've also toyed with insisting that it is the L space, but when we go to the L space, it's sort of the inside out of the L space, and it's incomprehensibly weird and impossibly surreal. They're all each other's inverse opposite side of the multi-headed fractal coin, to coin a term, pardon the pun of maybe total abject failure there, but what pains him to no end, the incorrigible, is knowing that he's bound in a universe where he's so effectively prevented from opening his own third eye that it seems impossible he could ever convince others that that's precisely what everyone has to do, right? That he's so effectively prevented from accessing his own spiritual, energetic, chakra, energy, transcendental, esoteric machinery, because in an organic, living light kind of way, that's what it is. It is part of the inherent machinery of the human organism. It's just been neglected and obfuscated into apparent non-existence, right? It still exists. It's still there. It's just objectified into non-perceptibility. And he has to bootstrap himself through this iterative writing of many storylines into collectively like harmonizing all the other hyperverses into convergence. He thinks he can force that with some sort of magic monster machine that he wants to build, and it cannot. But he also knows that he cannot because he wrote the story about his failure and learning the lesson that he cannot, which I have yet to finish writing. Having expressed all that, I realize I've been rambling for longer than I intended to, and I thank you humbly for listening to this rough draft, raw recording of the metaverse world building ideas and concepts behind everything incorrigible Mr. Zeppo and the Zeppo-verse. Please don't steal any of these ideas, as this is literally me working on drafting them up into a viable, functional, readable book series, and hopefully you'll support and respect the process I'm trying to share in this content creation Internet 3.0 economy that we live in. And so you'll support it by listening to more of the podcast and reading more of the sample chapter pages, and maybe even considering donating to the fundraiser so that this can become the full-time process that sustains and enables me to become a job creator. Because I need help, I can't build all the crazy things I want to build on my own. And I don't have the venture capital readily available to me yet in order to be that job creator. But I'm at that basement foundation stone laying groundbreaking level where you can still join me on the 10-year-long journey to overnight success as a believer, as a fan follower, as a street team sharer and distributor of the content as it exists and is monetized now, and also a contributor to the crowdfunding in whatever humble, small way that you can, or whatever big, empowering way you may be empowered to do. And having expressed all that, I say thank you and namaste to you. I'll come back at you again in the not-too-distant future. Peace. Please stay tuned for the updrafted version of this episode, where I'll be doing, sometime in the not-too-distant future, some sound design work and some Foley work to back up this track and some of the idea development, and maybe some editing so that some of the parts where I lose track of what I'm thinking of make more sense and flow better.